Welcome back, Philosophy 135. Dr. K here. I hope you all are doing well. So in our last video, we talked about some properties or qualities that arguments could have, namely those of validity and invalidity, soundness and unsoundness. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of some basic terms or concepts in logic or argumentation. In particular, we're going to discuss some related notions of assumptions, both implicit and explicit assumptions, and we're also going to talk about consistent and inconsistent propositions. So let's start with the notion of an implicit assumption. An implicit assumption is any proposition that you have to add to an argument to make it valid. It's any proposition that you have to add to an argument to make it valid. So let's go down and have a look at some examples. So consider argument J. 1, God is outside of space. 2, thus God has no location in space. There's obviously a jump between the premise and conclusion here, such that the conclusion doesn't follow from the premise. There has to be something else that you have to add to that argument to make it a valid argument. That's to say, an argument where if the premises were true, the conclusion would also be true. So what is that premise, or what is that proposition that you have to add to this argument, the argument in J, to make it valid? Well, it would be something like this. Nothing outside of space has a location in space, right? So if God is outside of space and nothing outside of space has a location in space, then it follows that God has no location in space. Let's look at argument K now for another example. So say someone wanted to argue that God is just, and they did so in the following manner. Premise 1, God has all perfections. 2, which is the conclusion, thus God is just. Okay, there's an obvious jump there. Something is missing, right? What might you have to add to the argument to make it valid? That's to say, to make it such that it has a set of premises which, if they were true, then the conclusion would also be true. Well, the implicit assumption is something like this. Justice, or being just, is a perfection, right? So let's plug that back into the original argument in conjunction with premise 1. So 1, God has all perfections, implicit assumption. Justice, or being just, is a perfection. Therefore, God is just, right? So again, an implicit assumption is any proposition that you have to add to an argument to make it valid, right? So when you have an argument and it looks like it's invalid, that's to say the reasoning isn't complete. It's not the case that the premise or premises by themselves entail the conclusion. There has to be something else that's missing. When you figure out what that connecting proposition is, which makes it a valid argument, then you've figured out what the implicit assumption is. So this is a kind of powerful notion to have down and to use in your thought when you listen to people reasoning and look at the evidence that they give for the conclusion that they're trying to push, or the claim that they're trying to push. If it's not complete, you can be attuned to that and think about, what is it that they're implicitly assuming for the evidence that they've offered to actually entail the conclusion that they want to push. And then you can bring it out and bring it to light and say, well, you're assuming this in order for your argument to work. And maybe we'll see that the assumption, implicit assumption, is bad. It's not a good proposition to have, or not one that's true. So having defined an implicit assumption and looked at some examples, let's now turn to defining what an explicit assumption is. So an explicit assumption is any proposition in an argument that is not itself argued for, right? It's any proposition in an argument that is not itself argued for. So if you want examples of an explicit assumption, we can look at premise 1 in both argument J and argument K above. So again, argument J went, God is outside of space. therefore God has no location in space. The explicit assumption here is a proposition in an argument that's not itself argued for. So 2 is being argued for on the basis of 1, right? 1, God is outside of space. There is no argument being offered for that. It's just being stated, but it's being stated explicitly, and in that sense, it's an explicit assumption because it's a proposition in an argument. It's also one that's not itself being argued for. Now look at argument K. God has all perfections, thus God is just. God has all perfections. It's a proposition in an argument, but there's not an argument that's being offered for it. There's been no reasoning given to support that God has all perfections. And in that sense, it's a proposition in an argument that it's not itself argued for, and therefore it's what I want to call an explicit assumption. If we go back for more examples and look at argument A and argument B that we considered earlier, argument A ran as follows. God is a perfect being. Existence is a perfection. Thus, God exists. Okay, there are propositions in this argument that are not argued for, namely the claims in 1 and 2. God is a perfect being. It's a proposition in an argument, but there's no argument given for it. Thus, it's an explicit assumption. Premise 2. Existence is a perfection. It's a proposition in an argument. It's not itself being argued for. There's no further evidence given for it. Thus, it as well is an explicit assumption. Same thing with argument B. 1, evil is a thing. 2, God is the source of all things. 3, thus God is the source of evil. So 1 and 2 in that argument are not, they're propositions, but they're not being argued for. There's just a statement, evil is a thing. There's no argument that evil is a thing, right? There's no further evidence. And the same thing for 2. God is the source of all things. It's a statement in the argument, but what's the evidence for it? There's none offered. And in that sense, it's what we call, and we want to identify as an explicit assumption, which again is a proposition in an argument that is not itself argued for. Okay, so we've talked about the notions of implicit and explicit assumptions. What I want to turn to now is discussing the notions of consistency or inconsistency, or in other words, consistent propositions and inconsistent propositions. So consistent propositions are propositions that could all be true at the same time. For example, the propositions or claims God exists and God is all good. These propositions could all be true at the same time, and thus they are consistent. Here's another example. Take the claims or propositions, it is raining and God exists. These propositions could both be true at the same time, and in that way, they're consistent. Here, there's plenty more examples. Say the grass is green and the sun is out. Those propositions can both be true at the same time, and in fact, they actually are true in the same time with respect to the location I'm in right now. Something, that's tricky is notice what's being said. For claims to be consistent, it doesn't have to be the case that they actually are all true. It just has to be the case that they could all be true at the same time. So look, it's a fact right now that the sun is out and the grass is green, right? So those statements are both true, but it could be the case that I sprayed pesticide all over my grass and it was all brown and the sun was not out, right? It was covered, it was a cloudy day. The actual truth value of the propositions does not matter when you're determining whether they're consistent or not. What matters is whether they could all be true at the same time and not whether they actually all are true. So consistent propositions are just propositions that can all be true at the same time. They're propositions between which there stands no tension or conflict or incompatibility, okay? They can all be true at the same time. Doesn't mean they actually are all true at the same time, but they could be without any conflict. Inconsistent propositions, however, are propositions that cannot all be true at the same time. Inconsistent propositions are propositions that cannot all be true at the same time. For an example of such propositions, look at example 3 below. God exists, that's one proposition, and God does not exist. Those propositions cannot all be true at the same time. In fact, that right there is what we call a contradiction. Assertion of a statement and a direct denial of that statement together, right? So those statements are inconsistent. Here's another example, in example 4. Consider these propositions. God exists, evil exists, and if God exists, evil does not exist. Can these propositions all be true at the same time? God exists, evil exists. If God exists, evil does not exist. Think about that for yourself. If it's true that if God exists, evil does not exist, and it's true that God exists, then it's false that evil exists. Alternatively, if it's true that God exists and it's true that evil exists, it can't be the case that if God exists, evil does not exist. And lastly, if it's the case that if God exists, evil does not exist, and it's the case that evil exists, then it's false that God exists. So these claims cannot all be true at the same time. If any two of them are true, then the third is false. Okay, so we've gone now over the notions of implicit and explicit assumptions, consistent and inconsistent propositions. In the next video, we're going to turn to discussing a very useful form of argumentation or argumentation strategy that you can use to try to challenge or show a claim or proposition is false, namely what's called the reductio ad absurdum. So I'll see you in the next video. Dr. K out.